The ruins of Drakkar 4 stretched endlessly beneath twin moons, casting long shadows across shattered nesting grounds. Among the broken shells and collapsed stone towers, a small dragonling pressed herself against the cold metal of an abandoned warehouse. The wind howled through the empty structures, carrying with it the smell of ash and forgotten dreams. Her name was Ember, at least that's what she'd begun calling herself in the lonely years since the others disappeared. The word had been painted on a rusted container she'd claimed as shelter, and it seemed fitting. Her scales shimmered copper and gold in the moonlight, the last spark of a dying flame. When she moved, they caught the light like precious metals, a reminder of the beauty her kind once brought to this world. She was 3 cycles old now. Old enough to remember her mother's warmth, young enough that those memories felt like fever dreams that slipped away whenever she tried to hold them tight. The great dragons of Drakkar 4 had been magnificent, wings spanning 50 feet, intelligence rivaling any species in the galaxy, voices that could shake mountains or whisper softer than wind. They had built cities of stone and song, raised their young with patience and wisdom, and lived in harmony with the planet that had birthed them. Then the mining corporation came and everything changed. Ember didn't understand the details. She'd been too young, barely out of her shell. But she remembered the sky turning orange, remembered the screaming that echoed across the valley, remembered her mother's scales hot against her own as she was pushed deep into a thermal vent. Her mother's voice had been gentle even then, promising to return, telling her to stay hidden no matter what happened. Her mother never returned. None of them did. The corporation called it a terraforming accident. Catalytic cascade, uncontrolled atmospheric conversion, tragic miscalculation. Words that meant nothing to a hatchling hiding in darkness while her world burned above. They were just sounds, empty and cold, that couldn't bring back the warm bodies that once filled the nesting grounds. Couldn't undo the silence that replaced the songs. Now, Ember hunted alone through the ruins, a ghost in her own home. She'd learned which automated drones to avoid, their red scanning lights sweeping through the darkness like mechanical eyes searching for intruders. She knew which water sources were still clean, trickling from underground springs the corporation hadn't managed to poison. She'd discovered where the protein-rich fungus grew in the old storage facilities, bitter but filling enough to keep her alive. She survived, day after day, season after season. But surviving wasn't living, and Ember knew the difference. Her days followed a pattern born of necessity and loneliness. She woke with the first sun, when the air was cool and the drones were in their charging cycle. She'd hunt for food, sometimes finding old ration packs left behind by the corporation workers, sometimes catching the small lizards that had somehow adapted to the changed atmosphere. She'd drink from her secret water source, a spring hidden beneath a collapsed transport station. Then she'd explore, mapping the ruins in her mind, searching for anything useful or interesting or just different from the day before. But it was the evenings that defined her existence. Every evening, as the twin moons rose and painted the sky in shades of silver and blue, she climbed to the highest point of the ruins. The skeleton of what had once been the colony's central spire reached toward the stars like broken fingers. The climb was dangerous. Loose metal, unstable platforms, gaps that could swallow a careless dragonling whole. But Ember made the climb anyway because from up there she could see beyond the ruins. From up there she could see the stars emerging in the darkening sky, countless and cold and beautiful. And every evening, she performed the ritual her mother had taught her in those precious few months before the end. Ember raised her head, filled her lungs with the thin air, and sang. The call of her people was like nothing else in the galaxy, part song, part resonance, part electromagnetic pulse that carried through the atmosphere and into space itself. It spoke of location, of identity, of hope and longing and the deep ache of being alone. Her mother had told her that dragons could hear each other across star systems if they listened carefully enough, that their songs traveled faster than light, that distance meant nothing to those who truly listened. Ember's call rang out across the dead colony, bounced off metal and stone, vibrated through the empty air, and faded into silence. She waited as she always did, her heart beating fast with hope that never quite died. She listened with every sense she possessed, her scales tingling with the effort of reaching out into the void. No one answered. No one ever answered. But she sang anyway because it was all she had left of home. 3 cycles of calling into the void, 3 cycles of silence in return, 3 cycles of hope deferred but never quite extinguished. She sang because her mother had taught her to sing. She sang because somewhere in the vast darkness of space, maybe someone could hear. She sang because the alternative was accepting that she was truly, completely, forever alone. And that was a truth too terrible to accept. So Ember sang, her voice carrying notes of sorrow and defiance, of memory and hope. She sang until her throat was raw and her scales had lost their glow. She sang until the moons reached their peak and began their slow descent toward morning. Then she climbed down, returned to her shelter, and curled up in the darkness to wait for another dawn. Somewhere in her young heart, Ember believed that one day, someone would hear her. That one day her song would find an answer. That one day she wouldn't be alone anymore. She just never expected that someone would be human. The wandering star hit Drakkar IV's atmosphere with all the grace of a wounded bird. Warning lights blazed across the cockpit like angry red stars as Captain Rebecca Martinez fought the controls, swearing creatively in 3 languages she'd picked up during her years hauling cargo across the outer rim. "Come on, baby, don't do this to me," she muttered through gritted teeth, her hands dancing across the console as she coaxed the failing drive systems. The ship shuddered and groaned around her, metal screaming in protest. "We're so close. Just a little further. You can make it." The landing was rough but survivable. The ship groaned and settled with a series of metallic complaints onto what had once been a landing pad, now cracked and overgrown with strange twisted plants. Becca sat in the pilot's seat for a long moment, her hands still gripping the controls, catching her breath as her heart hammered against her ribs. Sweat dripped down her face despite the cool air flowing through the vents. Finally, she released her death grip on the controls and began the diagnostic sequence, watching the numbers scroll across her screen with growing dread. Drive core, critical failure. Estimated repair time, 72 hours minimum. Perfect, she sighed, slumping back in her seat. Just perfect. 3 days stuck on a dead planet with limited supplies and no backup. She rubbed her tired eyes. Could be worse, I guess. Could be on fire. Becca was a salvager by trade, one of the independents who made their living recovering what the big corporations left behind when they moved on to their next profitable venture. She was 42, weathered by years in space, with gray threading through her dark hair like silver wires and laugh lines around her brown eyes that told stories of better times. She'd seen 100 dead colonies, 1,000 abandoned stations, picked through the bones of corporate greed more times than she could count. One more shouldn't matter. One more ruined world shouldn't make her feel anything at all. But something about Drakkar 4 felt different from the moment she'd entered orbit. Wrong in a way she couldn't quite name. She pulled up the planetary records while her repair drones deployed with mechanical efficiency, their tiny forms scuttling across the hull to assess the damage. The official report was clinical and cold, the way corporate reports always were. Catastrophic terraforming accident, total ecosystem collapse, no survivors. The colony had been evacuated within 48 hours, the planet marked as hazardous and abandoned, case closed, move along. Except the records showed this had been a Drakkar dragon breeding world. One of the last sanctuaries for a species that had once soared through the skies of a dozen planets. Becca's jaw tightened as she read the details. She'd heard about the Drakkar during her academy days, before she dropped out to chase salvage contracts. Gentle giants they'd been called. Intelligent enough to understand complex mathematics, peaceful enough to welcome other species to their worlds, their songs said to be the most beautiful sound in the galaxy. An entire species, wiped out because some corporate executive had cut corners on safety protocols to save a few credits. The thought made her sick. She grabbed her jacket and stepped out of the ship into the dying light of Drakkar IV's sun. The air was breathable but tasted of ash and chemicals, coating her tongue with bitterness. The ruins sprawled before her in every direction, a monument to greed and negligence. Broken towers reached toward the sky like accusing fingers. Shattered buildings leaked their contents across cracked streets. Everywhere she looked, she saw death. That's when she heard it. At first, Becca thought it was just the wind whistling through the broken structures, the way abandoned places always seem to moan and cry. But no, there was a pattern to it, a melody that rose and fell with deliberate rhythm. Haunting and lonely, it resonated in her chest, made her bones vibrate with sympathetic frequency like she was a tuning fork struck by an invisible hand. She'd never heard anything like it in all her years of space travel. A dragon song. Becca's heart hammered against her ribs. The record said no survivors. The official reports were clear: total extinction, not a single living creature left on this poisoned rock. But that sound was alive, was real, was calling out into the darkness with a desperation that made her throat tight. She grabbed her scanner from her belt with shaking hands and followed the signal. The readings led her through the ruins, past collapsed buildings with their guts spilled across the ground and overgrown courtyards where alien plants had taken root in the corpse of civilization. Her scanner pinged steadily, growing stronger with each step. One life form, warm-blooded, approximately 15 feet long. Moving with purpose through the rubble. Becca's breath came faster as she navigated around a fallen pillar and squeezed through a gap between two leaning structures. The song grew louder, more clear, vibrating through the air like electricity. Her skin prickled with goosebumps. She rounded a corner and froze, every muscle in her body locking up. The dragonling stood in a shaft of moonlight that pierced through the broken roof above, scales gleaming copper and gold like living metal. She was smaller than the historical record suggested dragons should be. Young, Becca realized with a jolt of understanding. Still growing, still just a kid really. The creature's head swiveled toward her with fluid grace, and suddenly Becca was staring into eyes that were wide and luminous, reflecting the moonlight like molten metal. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Becca saw intelligence in those eyes. Not animal cunning but real awareness, real understanding. And beneath that, she saw something that made her chest ache with recognition. Loneliness. Deep and terrible and all-consuming. The dragonling hissed, a warning sound that echoed off the ruins, and spread her wings in a threat display that would have been impressive if Becca couldn't see how thin she was, how her ribs showed through those beautiful scales. "Easy," Becca said softly, raising her empty hands slowly. "Easy there. I'm not gonna hurt you." The next morning, Ember crept through the ruins toward the strange vessel that had fallen from the sky. Her claws scraped softly against broken concrete as she moved from shadow to shadow, every instinct screaming at her to be careful. Curiosity warred with caution in her young mind, a battle that played out with every hesitant step forward. She'd survived this long by being careful, by avoiding the drones with their red scanning eyes, by staying hidden in the deep places where the machines never ventured. But she'd also survived by being smart, by learning, by adapting to a world that had tried to kill her. And this newcomer was different from the machines. The machines were cold, predictable, following patterns she'd learned to anticipate. This creature was warm, unpredictable, and something about the way it had stood there last night, hands raised in a gesture Ember didn't understand, made her want to know more. She found a vantage point behind a collapsed wall, wedging herself into a gap where she could see without being seen. The morning sun cast long shadows across the landing pad, and Ember settled in to watch. The human was working outside her ship, and repair drones buzzed around her like mechanical insects, their movements sharp and efficient. Becca had set up a portable workstation on a flat section of broken pavement and was elbow-deep in a drive component, her hands moving with practiced skill. Tools were scattered around her in organized chaos, and she muttered to herself in a constant stream of sound. "Flux couplings completely shot. Of course it is. Why would anything be easy?" She pulled out a blackened piece of machinery and tossed it aside with disgust. 20 years of flying and I've never seen one burn out this badly. Stupid, cheap, corner-cutting manufacturers. Ember tilted her head, listening to the strange sounds that poured from the human's mouth. Language. Her mother had told her about language in those precious few months before the end. She'd explained that other species used language differently than dragons did, that they couldn't sing to each other across the stars, that they needed to be close to communicate. It had seemed sad to young Ember then, this limitation that kept them bound to proximity. It seemed even sadder now, listening to this creature talk to herself because there was no one else to hear. Becca paused in her work, wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand and glanced around. Her eyes swept across the ruins, not quite finding Ember's hiding spot, but she seemed to sense something. The human's posture changed, became less focused on the work and more alert to her surroundings. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into a supply crate beside her workstation and pulled out a ration pack. She held it for a moment, turning it over in her hands, then looked out toward the ruins again. "I know you're out there," Becca said conversationally, her voice carrying across the quiet morning air. She wasn't looking in any particular direction, just speaking to the empty space around her. "Probably watching me right now, aren't you? It's okay. I'd be watching too if I were you." Strange alien shows up in a noisy ship, starts tearing apart machinery. "Yeah, I'd definitely be keeping an eye on that." Ember went very still, barely breathing. Could the human see her? No, impossible. Her hiding spot was too good and she'd been so careful. Becca opened the ration pack with a soft tearing sound. Inside were protein bars wrapped in shiny material, dried fruit in sealed pouches, and small packets of nutrient supplements. She laid them out carefully on a flat piece of debris about 20 feet from her ship, arranging them like an offering. "I'm guessing you're probably hungry," Becca said, still not looking directly at any hiding spot. "This place doesn't look like it has much food left. And you're young, still growing. Growing kids need to eat." She straightened up, dusted off her hands. So here. No strings attached. Just food if you want it. Then she returned to her work, pointedly ignoring the offering she'd left, her attention seemingly consumed by the repairs. Ember watched for an hour, her muscles cramping from staying so still. The human worked steadily, stopping occasionally to wipe sweat or take a drink from a water bottle. She never looked toward the food, never checked to see if anyone had taken it. She just worked, talked to herself about flux couplings and power conduits and things Ember didn't understand. Finally, curiosity overcame caution. Moving like liquid shadow, Ember crept forward, her eyes never leaving the human. 20 feet. 15. 10. The human didn't turn, didn't react. Ember's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She snatched the food in her jaws and retreated in one fluid motion, expecting shouts or sudden movements or worse. Nothing. The human just kept working, muttering about replacement parts. Back in her hiding spot, Ember examined her prize. The protein bars were strange but edible, with a texture nothing like the fungus she'd been surviving on. Better than fungus. Much, much better. The dried fruit was sweet, almost painfully so, awakening taste memories she'd nearly forgotten. The next day the human left more food. Closer this time, only 15 feet from the ship. And the next day closer still. By the fourth day, Ember was eating while Becca worked, maintaining a careful distance of about 10 feet but no longer fleeing at every movement. She'd learned the human's rhythms, the way she moved, the sounds she made. Learned that Becca was careful, predictable in her own way, non-threatening. The human kept up a steady stream of conversation while she worked, and Ember found herself listening, trying to understand the patterns in the sounds. You know, I had a kid once, Becca said one afternoon, recalibrating a power conduit with gentle precision. Her voice was softer than usual, thoughtful. Emily. Beautiful girl, smart as a whip. She'd be about 25 now if... She paused, and Ember saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. Station accident. 12 years ago. Explosive decompression in the cargo bay. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time. They told me she didn't suffer, that it was instant. Like that makes it better. Like knowing she didn't feel pain somehow fills the hole she left behind. Ember didn't understand the words, couldn't grasp the specific meaning. But she understood grief. It was there in every line of the human's body, in the way her shoulders curved inward, in the way her voice cracked on certain sounds. Grief was a language that needed no translation. Becca's shoulder took 3 days to heal enough for her to work properly. The burn from the security drone had been deep, cutting through skin and muscle, leaving an angry red mark that throbbed with every movement. But Ember never left her side during that time, and that made all the difference. The Dragonling brought food from her secret caches scattered throughout the ruins, packages of preserved rations she'd hoarded, strange fruits from plants that had adapted to the poisoned soil, even fresh water carried carefully in her mouth from her hidden spring. She kept watch while Becca slept, her luminous eyes scanning the darkness for threats, positioning herself between the injured human and the entrance to the ship. And whenever the pain seemed worst, when Becca would gasp and clutch her shoulder with tears streaming down her face, Ember would press close and glow softly with that warm bioluminescence that somehow eased the burning. On the second day, when the worst of the pain had dulled to a manageable ache, Becca started teaching Ember words. She hadn't planned it really. It just happened naturally as they sat together in the cargo hold, Becca pointing at things and naming them. Simple ones at first. Food, she said, holding up a protein bar. Food. Ember tilted her head, watching Becca's mouth form the sound. Then she made a noise, something between a chirp and a growl that sounded nothing like the word but showed she was trying. Water, Becca said, pointing to her canteen. Safe, she added, gesturing to the ship around them. Danger, she finished, pointing outside toward where the drone had attacked. Ember was quick. Frighteningly, incredibly quick in a way that made Becca's scientific mind spin with possibilities. By the third day, the Dragonling recognized dozens of words and had started making sounds that actually approximated human speech. Her throat wasn't built for it, her vocal cords shaped for those haunting songs rather than human language, but she adapted with determination that bordered on obsession. MBR, the Dragonling said carefully on the third afternoon, pointing one claw at herself. The syllables were rough, awkward, but unmistakably intentional. Becca grinned despite the pain still pulsing in her shoulder. That's right, Ember. That's you. Her voice cracked with emotion. You brilliant, amazing girl. Bexy, Ember tried, the syllables even more awkward in her throat, coming out almost like Baku, with a strange clicking sound in the middle. Close enough, Becca laughed, a real laugh that surprised her with its warmth. She felt something in her chest that had been frozen for 12 years begin to thaw, ice cracking and falling away to reveal raw, tender feeling underneath. Close enough, sweetheart. They sat together in comfortable silence after that, and Becca let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to not be alone anymore. But reality couldn't be ignored forever, no matter how much she wanted to hide from it. On the fourth day, Becca's ship diagnostics finally turned green across the board. Repairs complete. All systems nominal. Spaceworthy. The sight of those green indicators should have filled her with relief. Instead, she sat in the cockpit staring at the navigation console and felt sick to her stomach, while rising in her throat. She pulled up the planetary records again with shaking hands, hoping she'd misremembered, hoping she'd gotten the timeline wrong. But no. There it was in cold, corporate language. Drakkar 4 was scheduled for final resource extraction in 5 months. The corporation would return with heavy machinery, the kind that could level mountains and drain seas. They'd strip mine the remaining minerals from the planet's crust, extract every last valuable element, and leave nothing but a barren rock spinning in space. Everything Ember knew, every last trace of her people, every stone and shell and collapsed tower would be ground to dust and hauled away in cargo freighters. Becca looked out the viewport with burning eyes. Ember was exploring near the ship, investigating a piece of machinery with obvious curiosity and intelligence. She'd found an old scanning device and was turning it over in her claws, trying to figure out how it worked, her head tilting this way and that as she examined it from different angles. Leaving her here was a death sentence. There was no question about that, no room for debate or rationalization. In 5 months, Ember would die. Either she'd be killed by the machinery, or she'd starve when they destroyed the last sources of food and water, or she'd simply give up and let the loneliness take her. However it happened, it would be cruel and unfair and wrong. But taking her wasn't simple either. Becca pulled up the galactic conservation codes on her datapad, searching desperately for some loophole, some legal pathway that would let her do the right thing. The laws were clear and unforgiving. Drakkar dragons were listed as extinct. Not endangered, not protected, extinct. There were no provisions for survivors because the law assumed there were no survivors. Removing one from their home planet without proper authorization would be classified as illegal salvage at best, kidnapping an intelligent species at worst. The penalties were severe. She'd lose her license immediately. They'd confiscate her ship, her livelihood, everything she'd worked 20 years to build. She might face prison time, years locked away in some detention facility while lawyers argued about intent and precedent. Everything she had, everything she'd rebuilt after losing her daughter, after crawling out of the dark hole of grief that had nearly swallowed her whole, gone. Destroyed. Finished. Becca sat there for a long time watching Ember play through the viewport. The Dragonling had figured out how to activate the scanning device and was pointing it at different objects, watching the readout with fascination. She looked so young, so full of potential, so desperately, heartbreakingly alone. And Becca realized she'd already made her decision. Maybe she'd made it 3 days ago when she'd thrown herself between Ember and that drone. Maybe she'd made it the first moment she'd seen those intelligent, lonely eyes. It didn't matter when. What mattered was that there was no universe in which she could fly away and leave this child to die alone. The first month was an adjustment for both of them, a dance of learning and adaptation that transformed the wandering star from a lonely cargo ship into something that felt almost like a home. Ember grew rapidly with proper nutrition, adding 2 feet to her length in the first 3 weeks alone and developing strength Becca hadn't expected. The Dragonling's muscles filled out, her scales grew brighter and more lustrous, and her wings strengthened until they could create powerful gusts of air with each beat. The transformation was remarkable, like watching a wilted flower bloom after a long drought. The Dragonling learned to navigate zero gravity with surprising grace, using her wings for controlled movement through the ship's corridors. She'd push off from one wall, glide through the air with wings spread wide, and catch herself perfectly on the opposite side. Becca would watch her play in the cargo hold during acceleration breaks, spinning and diving through the open space with obvious joy, and feel her heart swell with something that felt dangerously close to hope. And Ember was smart. Frighteningly, impossibly smart in ways that made Becca question everything she thought she knew about intelligence and learning. Becca started leaving puzzles for her, mechanical problems, logic games, even simple repairs that needed doing around the ship. Ember solved them all with a focus that bordered on obsession, her 3-fingered claws proving surprisingly dexterous as she manipulated tools and components. She learned to read basic diagrams within 2 weeks, to recognize warning symbols and safety indicators, to understand the ship's systems well enough to help with routine maintenance. "You're going to put me out of a job," Becca joked one day, watching Ember rewire a control panel with careful precision, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. The Dragonling had independently figured out that the yellow wire went to the power coupling, not the red one. "Job," Ember repeated, looking up from her work. Her vocabulary was growing daily, new words added to her understanding with remarkable speed, though her grammar remained simple and direct. "Work. What I do." Becca paused, choosing her words carefully. "What we do now. Together." Ember's eyes brightened with understanding and something else, belonging, maybe, or purpose. "We," she said, testing the word, rolling it around in her mouth. "We do work." "Yeah, kiddo. We." Becca felt her throat tighten with emotion. But the legal problems loomed over them like storm clouds on a distant horizon, impossible to ignore no matter how much she wanted to pretend everything would be fine. Becca filed her reports carefully, avoiding core sectors where Galactic Council presence was heaviest, staying in the Rim territories where enforcement was lighter and officials asked fewer questions. She reached out to old contacts, people she'd helped over the years, looking for someone who might understand, who might be willing to help. That's when she found Dr. David Klein. Klein was a xenobiologist working at an independent research station on the frontier, one of the few scientists who'd actually studied Drakkar dragons before their extinction. His papers on dragon intelligence and communication were legendary in scientific circles, detailed observations cut short by the species' sudden disappearance. When Becca sent him an encrypted message with footage of Ember solving a mechanical puzzle, his response came back within hours, the text practically vibrating with excitement. "That's impossible. The records say total extinction. Where did you find her?" They met at a neutral station 3 weeks later, a rundown trading post where questions weren't asked and records weren't kept. Klein was in his 60s, silver-haired with deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent staring through microscopes and telescopes. He had the intense focus of someone who dedicated his entire life to understanding alien species, who saw the universe as an endless puzzle to be solved. He stood in the docking bay as Ember emerged from the ship, and he actually gasped, his scientific composure cracking like thin ice. His eyes went wide, his mouth fell open, and for a moment he just stared. "By all the stars," he whispered, his voice shaking. "She's magnificent. She's actually real. I thought I'd never." He trailed off, unable to finish. Ember, now nearly 20 feet long and still growing, regarded him warily. Her head lowered slightly, wings half spread in a defensive posture, years of survival instinct making her cautious of strangers. But when Becca stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Ember's neck, nodding that this new human was safe, Ember relaxed. Her wings folded, her posture softened, and she allowed Klein to approach. Klein spent 3 days examining Ember with Becca's permission, running non-invasive scans that made the Dragonling curious rather than afraid, recording her vocalizations with equipment that captured frequencies human ears couldn't detect, documenting her intelligence with tests that grew progressively more complex. On the 4th day he sat down with Becca in the station's shabby cafeteria over terrible coffee that tasted like engine cleaner. "She's not just intelligent," Klein said, his hands wrapped around his mug, voice low and serious.